Coming to you from Southern California, this is Mindset, mental health news and information. I'm your host, James Curtis. On today's show,
I am shocked that there are therapists out there doing therapy that haven't done their own therapy.
In our continuing series in cooperation with goodtherapy.org, the necessary things you should know about your therapist. The voice you just heard was today's guest, Noah Rubenstein, and if you listen to any of the previous episodes here on Mindset, his voice may indeed sound familiar. Noah is himself a licensed marriage and family therapist in the state of California, and today he talks about what we're calling question number 5 of the things you should know or things you should ask your therapist, namely, has your therapist gone to therapy? No, not just your sessions, but their own therapy sessions. Noah says the answer to that question should be yes. And yes, you should ask it. And there's something kind of funny about that question for me. It's like asking your doctor or one of your teachers about their grades in school. But aside from that, first, this news from the Mindset Report. Today, we feature an extended report from U.S. News and World Report healthcare reporter Kimber Leonard. The Mindset Report, available online at mindsetreport.com. The Mindset Report, your most comprehensive online source for mental health news. Today's Mindset Report is underwritten by Responsibility, a complete guide to bystander intervention by Alan Berkowitz, who is committed to the idea that the solution to health and social justice problems requires that we engage as bystanders. Responsibility is available online at lulu.com. Lulu spelled Lulu. The National Alliance on Mental Illness, NAMI, wants you to call your congressman and urge the co-sponsorship of a recently introduced bill. A bipartisan bill. The bill, the Comprehensive Justice and Mental Health Act of 2015, was introduced last week in both the United States Congress and the Senate, the House of Representatives and the United States Senate. Both bills would update and reauthorize the Mentally Ill Offender and Treatment Crime Reduction Act. The bills aim to reduce the number of nonviolent prisoners who, according to the bill's sponsors, are in need of quality mental health support and treatment rather than incarceration. Officials at the St. Elizabeth's Hospital in Washington, D.C. have joined John Hinckley's request to be set free and treated as an outpatient. Psychiatrists at St. Elizabeth's, where John W. Hinckley Jr. has lived since being found guilty by reason of insanity in the 1981 shooting of President Ronald Reagan and 3 others, told a federal court Wednesday that he should be released full-time to his mother's home in Williamsburg, Virginia. Federal prosecutors, citing safety concerns, oppose Hinckley's release absent a very long list of restrictions. Hinckley is now 59. And despite the success of the Affordable Care Act, or the ACA as it is also known, Obamacare, gaps still remain in mental and physical health care coverage. Healthcare reporter Kimber Leonard took a moment to talk to me about it. My guest is Kimber Leonard, healthcare reporter for U.S. News and World Report online at usnews.com. Kimberly, thanks for joining me, and I wanted to jump into a couple of articles that are in a way related and in other ways stand on their own. I want to start off with the article that you published on April 9th that talks about the healthcare disparities and Obamacare. According to your report, families still face racial and socioeconomic disparities even though they're insured. Can you talk a little bit about that?
That's right. So even for people who have bought insurance on the marketplaces, which are systems that are provided online through state or federal governments to buy tax-subsidized insurance, being able to afford paying premiums every month or possibly paying high deductibles when you go for care is still a really big struggle for a lot of people. The payments may seem small, but for someone who is living day to day and who is trying to make rent every month, might have school payments, it could be a lot more difficult to afford the prices that come with healthcare.
And one of the people that you talked to, Gary Delgado, who was one of the authors of the report that you cited, talks about the idea that even with, or I should say in spite of Medicaid expansion, because not all states have bought into the Medicaid expansion, that also poses a problem. That's
right. Expanding Medicaid was supposed to be a big part of the health care law, but the Supreme Court in 2012 ruled that states could opt to not expand Medicaid if they chose. As a result, we have some states that have expanded Medicaid and some that haven't, and as it would be expected, in states where they haven't expanded, you're seeing a lot more people who are uninsured. However, even for people who are in the expansion states who fall into that gap, who might still not qualify for Medicaid but have been able to buy health insurance on the marketplace, it still could be difficult to access care.
Along that same line that you touch on in your article is the lack of access to the internet, the technological or technical, or whatever the right word, I'll pick one of those, the technological sort of hurdles that people have to go through in order to get access to care as well.
That's right, and it was really striking, and it's something that I think is easy to take for granted, especially for those of us who live in large cities. Being able to access the internet is not something that everyone in America can do, particularly people in rural communities. One of the gentlemen spoke about his experience living in rural communities and said that they were encouraged to go to the library to look up different plans, but the library in their town was 15 miles away. So the setup in various communities really varies, and people's access to the internet makes looking at health insurance easier because all of the state and federal exchanges can be found online. And even though you can still access them in person and can still access them through the phone, it's much easier to just log onto your computer, compare plans, and be able to sign up using an email address.
I suppose that the way that the Obama administration has dealt with that issue, the rural nature of individuals who need the health care but can't get access to it, the technological barrier, not having internet access, the idea of, I believe they're called healthcare navigators that go out and are supposed to help people. Has that helped or done anything to remedy that issue?
You know, I don't have specific data on what kind of impact that particular aspect has had, but it's true that there are navigators that work for free to help people sign up for insurance, and they could be associated with different medical facilities, social groups. They are able to sit down with people and help them figure out what plan is best for them. And I know that they try to provide people who speak all different languages. I'm not sure that in every case that people are able to find a navigator who speaks their language. People are also able to get health insurance by calling, but it can still be difficult. With having access to the internet, you can really look at the different plans, and you can see what's available to you, and you can also check it regularly from home, and you can see what the different benefits are in your plan. If you go to a healthcare provider and you have insurance and you don't realize what's covered and what's not, you can end up with a very large medical bill.
The April 1st article where you discuss the gaps that still remain when it comes to covering mental health issues versus physical issues. Give us the overview of that issue.
Well, even though the Affordable Care Act really extended behavioral health services, which includes substance abuse and mental illness, mental health services, to 62 million patients, the definition of what that really means is extremely vague. The access that people have to healthcare is limited by the number of providers. There simply aren't enough psychiatrists. And the payments for prescription drugs are also extremely high in a lot of cases. So they're having trouble accessing medications. They're having trouble finding physicians. And there still exists a rough definition of the word parity, which is essentially how healthcare is reimbursed. And a lot of psychiatrists might opt to be paid privately and on an individual basis rather than go through an insurance company. So that will really limit the number of providers that can be seen, and some people can't wait. They need to be able to see a doctor as soon as possible.
NAMI, National Association on Mental Illness, authored a study that talks about a lot of these problems that have arisen because of what is referred to as lack of parity. What does that mean?
It's funny because I was asking a lot of people that exact same question, and I can't seem to get a clear answer. There doesn't seem to be a very strict definition of the word parity. It's kind of something that's hard to grasp. If you think about it, you can go into a medical office and you can spend 10 minutes with your doctor going over some flu symptoms that you might be having. The doctor writes you a prescription. And as opposed to that, you can go in and see a therapist and talk to him or her for an hour. And how do you reimburse that? Do you reimburse it in the same way? Is it as one appointment? Or do you reimburse it by the amount of time spent with a patient? It isn't very clear how it should all work. We do know that under the Affordable Care Act, mental health and substance abuse services are amongst the 10 essential health benefits. So under any healthcare plan that you pick, mental health and substance abuse needs to be, to some extent, covered. But the definition of parity is still extremely murky, and even the experts that I spoke with admitted that.
Speaking of definitions, the idea that authorizations from insurance companies, or that is to say, when the insurance company decides to cover and approve coverage for a mental health issue, or when they deny authorization, it seems that, and your article suggests that, there is similarly no agreed upon definition of the things that are covered and what's not. And so the insurance companies are left to their own devices to come up with their own definitions, and therefore it comes out a bit random in terms of what gets covered and what doesn't. Do I have that right?
Right. Some services are just determined not to be what they call medically necessary. And on top of that, being able to afford prescriptions was seen as a very large problem and maybe viewed as perhaps putting a certain amount more weight on prescription drugs for psychiatric issues than one would for certain medical issues. So I think all of that will get sorted out.
Are we headed toward a point perhaps where the sorting is happening and things are improving, or are we sort of in the middle, in the midst of trying to make this situation more workable for individuals who need mental health services?
I think the good news is that there are groups who are really tracking this carefully, and it's much more difficult for groups to argue for things like parity or for things like equal access when they don't have the data to back it up. But having done that, I think that a lot of politicians are going to be looking at this, and I think that they're going to be re-examining what they should be doing, because mental illness treatment and access to mental illness treatment is seen as a huge problem in the country. And if Obamacare hasn't addressed those issues, then they need to find something that does.
Kimber Leonard, health reporter, U.S. News and World Report. You can find her online at usnews.com. Thank you so much for taking the time today, Kimberly. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Jim.
And lastly, and on a personal note, a news item having little to do with the news of mental health. An individual who I am honored to call my friend, Loretta Lynch, was confirmed as Attorney General today. For details on these and other news stories that are about mental health, check out the Mindset Report online at mindsetreport.com. Back with today's topic, has your therapist been to their own therapy? Just a moment. Welcome back to Mindset, Mental Health News and Information. I'm your host, James Curtis. When it comes to picking a therapist, there are some things you should know. There's some things you should do. There are some things that you should ask. And as part of our ongoing series on how to pick a therapist, number 5 in that series falls under the heading of self-awareness. Your therapist's self-awareness. Here's licensed marriage and family therapist and founder of goodtherapy.org, Nora Rubenstein.
James, we've been talking about the necessary things that people should know about their therapist, things they can ask their therapist, either before they get started or sometimes even during therapy. And the 5th one is around self-awareness. And really the question you can ask your therapist is, have they done their own therapy? Has your therapist or counselor gone to their own psychotherapy? It's kind of an unusual question because, if you're going to, let's say you're going in for brain surgery, you don't need to ask your surgeon if they've had their own brain surgery because it really makes no difference. But becoming a psychotherapist is much different from becoming a brain surgeon. There are many people that would argue that psychotherapy should only be for those that have some sort of medical necessity. But I disagree. I think that psychotherapy can not only help to treat certain diagnoses, it helps the walking wounded. It can help all of us, whether we're looking to understand ourselves better, whether we're adjusting to some sort of life situation. And it works is helpful for those that are on the spiritual path. Psychotherapy is probably useful for most people, and if you're going to be a psychotherapist, in my humble opinion, I think one of the best ways to become a good therapist is to do your own therapy. And I would add to that it's particularly important for therapists to do their own therapy because most people that are drawn to the field of mental health and psychology have their own mental health issues. Most of us are drawn toward the field because we want to understand ourselves better and feel better about ourselves and resolve some of our own burdens from childhood. And if we're fortunate, we're aware of that. Those unfortunate are not aware of that. So I think the best healers in psychotherapy are those wounded healers who have identified what has drawn them to the field. They've identified some of their wounds, and they're really good at helping people to walk through the process of therapy because they've walked a similar path. I know personally it's one of the reasons that I'm good at helping people with family of origin issues and dealing with things like abandonment and neglect and grief because I know what those things feel like and I know how to take care of those kinds of parts. So I guess if I were to step back, I would say that it's not only one of the best ways to become a good therapist by doing your own therapy, that therapists there's almost like a responsibility, I think, for therapists to look at themselves and to know themselves better. And there are really great benefits that therapists get by doing their own therapy. They become better therapists because they know what it's like to be a client. They know what it feels like to be vulnerable. So many people are afraid to go to therapy. They're afraid of showing themselves. They're afraid of opening up. They're afraid of discovering that maybe they're flawed. They're afraid of opening up the closet and looking at things that haven't been looked at. So it's a very vulnerable place to be, and I think it's really useful for therapists to know what that feels like. But even more important than that, when a therapist does their own therapy, they know what the healing process entails. They know what healing feels like. They know how healing happens. If you've healed something yourself, then you know how to help other people to heal. I say this from personal experience that, I was doing therapy before I had really done my own therapy. I'd done some surface level therapy, But then I really did some therapy and made some really big internal shifts and unburdened some things that I'd been carrying for a long time. And boy, I knew what healing was after that. And I became such a better therapist because I knew how to help people heal. Now, they might be working with different issues, but the healing process in some ways is universal, regardless of the issue. So in addition to the things I've already mentioned, that when you do your own therapy as a therapist, you know what it's like to experience different therapists, different styles, different treatment models. You become more sensitive to how important the client-therapist relationship is. For example, I remember being in therapy with a therapist who just was talking way too much. And I really, well, it's something you learn very early on in graduate school that the client should be doing most of the talking, and that really, as a therapist, you don't really need to say very much. And you get that, but until you experience it, you don't really get how important it is. And so learning to address conflict with your therapist, to tell your therapist, to give your therapist feedback is not easy to do. Even as a therapist in therapy, it is difficult to say, hey, wait a second, I need to give you some feedback. So imagine how a client who doesn't have a mental health background feels, especially if they're sensitive and to the hierarchy and feels like the therapist has more power than them. It's going to be a challenge. So it really does sensitize you to some of these client-therapist relationship issues, and so I think it's such a positive experience for so many reasons. And I am shocked that there are therapists out there doing therapy that haven't done their own therapy.
So let me play with that idea for a moment. And let's take the scenario where you're a beginner at therapy. You haven't done a lot of therapy. You're searching around because you think you need to work some things out.
Uh-huh.
When you make the inquiry of your therapist about self-awareness, about whether or not they've done their own therapy, how do you know? How do you evaluate the response?
That's a good question. And the question, has your therapist done her own therapy or his own therapy, is really getting at a number of important issues, not just the ones I mentioned. It also gets at sort of the hierarchy, because my hunch is that those therapists that have not done their own therapy might consciously or unconsciously be in that camp of people who think that going to therapy means that there's something wrong with them.
Really?
Possibly. Because there are some therapists that really look at people in sort of this black and white, they're either in the healthy category or the not healthy, and they're very diagnostic and focused on pathology, and look at people that have diagnoses as being mentally ill. And so if they're coming from that perspective, then more of this sort of medical model approach, then they may be, less likely to go to therapy. So I think you're kind of getting at that a little bit. But really, it's also some of the other things that I've mentioned. Has the therapist healed some of their own stuff? Are they aware? Have they identified what some of their blind spots are? Are they willing to look at themselves? Are they willing to be vulnerable? Do they know what it's like to be a client? Do they understand how sensitive that client-therapist relationship is?
So maybe again, from an untrained, non-therapy experienced individual, a question might be for the therapist, have you ever gone to therapy?
Yeah, have you done your own therapy?
Okay.
Yeah, I'm sure that many therapists will feel on the spot because they're not used to being asked that question. And I think the response that I would appreciate seeing is an immediate, yes, I have. And it's really been a valuable, important part of my growth as a person and as a professional, because I've healed some of my own stuff, It's helped me to learn how to be a better therapist. It's taught me a lot about the healing process, so I've also become a good therapist from it. Now, I'm comfortable with that kind of response because in therapy, I don't feel like I need to hide myself or somehow look like my shit doesn't stink because I'm human. Other therapists are less comfortable with being vulnerable and really showing themselves. And I think, it's possible to be vulnerable without having a dual relationship and without self-disclosing too much. So that's the response that I would appreciate. Now, if a therapist got very defensive and didn't want to answer that question, to me that would raise other issues, because I'd like to be with someone who views us, the client and the therapist, as on the same sort of level in terms of hierarchy. So I would be concerned about having any response other than yes, I have, and it's been really beneficial for me. That's my personal
and that makes sense. I'm trying to get it down, obviously, to a way that somebody who presumably doesn't have your background, they don't have, or even my background, which is simply talking to you a lot and talking to a lot of other therapists. So now I have a sense of it. So you're looking for, when you ask that question, because that's a big question to me. That's one of those, and because of its unusual nature, it's not only going to be big for the client, but it's going to be big for the provider, the therapist who's being interviewed, so to speak. Mm-hmm. So in a nutshell, is this accurate? When you ask that question, have you done your own therapy, you're looking for not only a yes, but you're also looking for elaboration and some level of comfort with the idea of having done their own therapy and a willingness to, although you're not trying to dig down into what their issues are, but certainly a willingness to embrace the idea and acknowledgement that it has been helpful.
Yeah, because we're all human. We're all works in process. We all have our issues, and like I said earlier, my hunch is that those that are drawn into the field of mental health have their share of issues, if not more than the average bear, I guess I would say.
So now, taking the other side of that response paradigm, if you will, once that question is posed to a therapist that you're considering, if they get defensive or just shut down or act really uncomfortable in a way that prompts them not to want to disclose or not to disclose, is that the red flag that makes us walk out the door?
Well, people have to do what feels right to them. It would for me, and I would certainly be clear with the therapist that asks that question is, listen, I don't need to know what your issues are. That's your business, and I understand you want to protect the client-therapist relationship, not have a dual relationship, and not self-disclose too much about your personal life, because that would create a dual relationship. I get that. I'm not asking you to bend your boundaries. I just want to know if you've done your work, because I don't want to work with a therapist that doesn't understand what it's like to heal, who hasn't gone to therapy. I mean, to me, it makes no sense that that a therapist would do therapy for a living but not do their own therapy. It makes no sense whatsoever for a couple of reasons. One, because it's great learning, but two, because like I was mentioning in a previous show or in a previous interview with you, that being a therapist brings up lots of stuff. It can be very triggering. I think it was the last time we talked, I gave you that example of like how on Monday I would work with a client who reminds me of my father, and on Tuesday a client that reminds me of communicates the way my ex-girlfriend talks. On Wednesday I might speak with a client who is having anticipatory grief that triggers my own existential anxiety. I mean, you're constantly noticing things about yourself that need more work or needs more attention, and that is the occupational hazard of being a therapist, is that I don't think you can be a good therapist and not work on yourself. And the reason is that in order to be a good therapist, I think you need to embody that state of self where you're calm and you're compassionate And you can't do that if your stuff is getting triggered all the time. If your stuff is getting triggered, you're not staying calm and you're not focusing on the client and staying in that compassionate place. You're in your own head and in your own body, noticing your own reactions. And so that's why it's one of the reasons why therapists benefit from going to their own therapy, because it helps them to declutter and to stay present with their clients.
And if they don't do that, then I think the phrase is compassionate curiosity will have left the room at that point, because now the therapist is thinking about their own stuff as opposed to thinking about their client's stuff.
And, other therapists, those in the sort of psychodynamic, psychoanalytic tradition will use the word countertransference. So, if we're having a lot of countertransference reactions to our clients, if they're reminding us of people in our own lives, if we're having strong positive countertransference onto a client, or we're having strong negative countertransference onto a client, that's another sign that our stuff is getting triggered. But it's not always countertransference that happens. Sometimes we're just aware of our own suffering. We have clients that come in all the time that are working on stuff that are working on things inside of themselves that are very similar to things that we've either worked on in the past or things that we still need to work on, things that we're in the process of working on. So it's hard for me to imagine how a therapist can do this sort of deep work day in and day out without doing their own therapy. And maybe it's just sort of the process of a lifetime, as you age and as you have more experience, and that many therapists become more whole as life goes on.
And so one of the ways that an individual interviewing a therapist might look at this, at least part of it sounds like, that you want a therapist who understands what it's like to be on the patient end.
Yes.
Does that make the therapist more patient of the process that you're going to go through, and 2 steps forward, 1 step back sort of progression, or?
Oh, certainly, that's certainly a piece of it. When I talk about therapy and healing, what I usually tell people is that healing happens really quickly in therapy. Healing is almost instantaneous on a biochemical, neurological level, and
really?
Sure, it takes repeated exposure to that healing. But let me finish though. But getting to that place where healing happens can take a very long time. So, and that's because as a client, we have lots of, as anybody, I want to say client, it's just as a person, we have lots of protection, and so I guess I would say it this way, that I think I've expressed this in the past, that we're all born these loving, lovable beings. We come into the world fully equipped to be healthy and happy, but shit happens, and we get hurt, we get burdened, and we develop these ways of never being hurt again, these protective strategies, whether it's depression or it's some sort of addiction or some sort of avoidance, being self-critical. I mean, there are so many protective strategies that humans use. And again, those protective strategies are trying to keep that person from ever feeling hurt in the same way again. And so although a person wants to change when they come into therapy, they want to heal, they want to stop being self-critical, let's say, they want to stop being depressed, it's the only way they've known how to protect themselves. And so in order to get down to that vulnerable stuff and to heal that vulnerable stuff, it requires that client to begin doing the exact opposite of what they've been doing since they've been hurt, which is becoming more vulnerable, which is relaxing the protection. And so a lot of therapy in the beginning is about building trust, relaxing all those protective parts, those protective strategies, and helping that client to embody their own curiosity and their own self-compassion for their protective parts and for those vulnerable wounds. And in some people who, for whatever reason, are more ready, that process can happen very quickly in a matter of weeks. I mean, I've had people come in on the first session that have no protection, virtually no protection in the way, and do some amazing healing work in a first session. Now, it's very rare. And then at the other end of the spectrum, there are people that I've worked with for a number of years that we're still working on making it safe enough for them to go near parts of them that have been very hurt. So, but once those protective parts relax and a person can bring curiosity and self-compassion to the parts of them that are wounded, it doesn't take a lot of time to shift the energy that's stored in the body and the emotional body, and to heal. So,
wow.
In my experience, healing and change can happen instantaneously when you get to that place where a person is ready. The reason therapy takes so long is because getting to that place where healing can happen can take a very long time, depending on how protected a person is. Now, I'm not one that believes in miracle cures, because that sounds very miraculous. Many, like we've been learning over the last 20 years from neuroscience that for the brain to change, for our chemistry to change, it takes repeated experiences, repeated healing experiences, where we're it's almost like classical conditioning of the mind, so and the heart. Large unburdenings, large healings can happen where we have a tremendous shift, but in order for that change to last, we have to keep revisiting that place and keep bringing whatever is necessary to those old, traumatized, burdened parts, so that healing can eventually lock in.
Okay. Now I want to explore.
That sure sounds like a lot of psychobabble, doesn't it?
No, actually, it doesn't. It makes well.
You've been hanging out with too many therapists lately.
Hanging out with you guys too long, so it makes sense to me. But let's take another side road that you mentioned. I want to follow up on.
Sure.
The idea that healing can happen very quickly. It's just getting to the place where you can heal. It can take a long time.
Yeah.
Is very intriguing. Is that something that you want from a therapist's point of view, patient to know, or is that something you simply would rather them experience?
It depends. I mean, it's not something that I necessarily will talk to somebody about. If they ask me, how long is therapy going to take? And I say, well, I don't know. It varies, and it depends on many factors. For some people, it can take a matter of weeks. For some people, it can take a matter of years. It depends on who you are, what you're needing to work on. And if they want more information, then, I will talk about how I'll give them sort of my take on people and how they get hurt and how they heal, and protective parts and wounded parts and what's required for healing. So only as much information as is necessary. Sometimes during the therapy process, people feel discouraged. Those people that have a lot of protection, everybody sees some immediate results from therapy initially. I won't say everybody, but most people, because they're feeling heard, they're feeling like they've gained an ally in the healing process. There's someone that understands them, that's safe, that's witnessing them. But then, if someone has a lot of protection and the process of getting down through that maze of protective parts to the core issues is taking a long time, well, that can cause one to feel discouraged and feel like they're not getting anywhere and feel like it's taking forever. And then that's a good time to kind of talk about the therapy process again.
Noah Rubenstein, goodtherapy.org. That's it for today's show. I always love getting your comments. positive or otherwise. No, really, I do. Leave me a note on our Facebook page, Twitterverse, or in the comments section on Spreaker. Thanks so much for tuning in. Check out the Mindset Podcast on your favorite platform, iTunes, iHeartRadio, TuneIn Radio, YouTube, or Spreaker, and visit the Support Us tab on MindsetShow.com. Buy some stuff. Support our show through buying stuff on that page. Coming up next week.
I'm Monica Richardson, and I'm the filmmaker of an upcoming film documentary called The 13th Step. I'm an activist. I have a blog talk radio called Safe Recovery, but I'm really focused right now on the film and releasing it and going to the Beverly Hills Film Festival at the end of the month.
If someone was coming and listening to you for the first time and really, like most people, don't know a lot about AA if they haven't already done it, or maybe have done a little bit of it or thinking about doing it, give us sort of the broad stroke, the overall focus of what you're doing and why you're doing it.
Well, what I'm doing is trying to warn people that Alcoholics Anonymous is not safe, that the courts are ordering violence and sex offenders to AA unknown to the public and unknown to AA members, and they've been doing it for decades. The reason that I decided to make the film is that Christine and Sandra Katz were murdered in the summer of 2010. He was court-ordered by a judge and a healthcare professional. Claiborne Connolly was his name. We were like, and he had priors of being violent against women, and we're like, well, why would you do that? And then we began to dig and could see that he wasn't the only one who was court-ordered to Alcoholics Anonymous who had a violent past. And I was really shocked. So a lot of people think that AA is a government agency, and the reason they think that is because everybody who gets a DUI is actually getting sent there. And that's not the only group that gets sent there. So everybody, 1.4 million people in 2010 got a DUI in the United States. But everybody who goes to rehab is also, 90% of the rehabs about are 12-step based, or AA. And so when they leave there, they're told, oh, you should go to AA when you leave that rehab for support. And people think that AA is run by a trained professional. And I was really shocked as I met people like Gabrielle Glaser and people who were journalists even at CBS News when I asked them, do you think AA is run by a professional? And they were like, oh, yeah. And then I asked like a 20-year-old on the street in Santa Monica, as we did like man on the street kind of interviews. And they're like, oh, yeah. And I was like, or they went, well, it should be, you know. And, of course, I knew because I was a member for decades that it's run by just anybody. It's a layperson support group that was created in the 30s. It hasn't changed since then.
Next week, we begin a new occasional series, a new segment on pitfalls. Some drugs have side effects, some approaches have pitfalls, and while Alcoholics Anonymous itself is clearly a program that has helped and continues to help countless individuals, does the way some courts use the faith-based peer support program, is it problematic? Until next week, for Mindset, Mental Health News, and Information, I'm your host, James Curtis. If you want to find out more ahead of time of next week's show about Monica Richardson's show about her movie, that she's produced, it's touring film festivals at the end of the month. It will be at the film festival that she mentioned. You can find it online at The 13th Step, 13 spelled out 13.com. Dare to see mental health differently, because understanding why we do what we do helps us all do better. See you next week.